Today we're going to draw and watercolor a beautiful crow. Hello, welcome back. Today we're watercoloring this beautiful crow and full moon. What I want to do today is help you strategize and visualize in order to complete your watercolor works, and also practice with some exercises to strengthen your layering and your wet on wet techniques. We're going to be using mostly black for our main subject, so mixing your colors, mixing your layers, and working with delicate brushstrokes to pull all the light and shadow and textures from these variations of black. Well, let's get to it. First thing, I'm going to biggest, simplest, and I'm just going to add a few strokes, few lines. Most importantly is where the feet touch the branch. So already I could see I'm too much in the center. I want to be just a little bit off to the side. I'm going to make that correction. Just a few millimeters to the right. There we are. Beautiful negative space to play with between the legs. And then the overall big oval shape. So this is going to give me an idea. Okay, the feet, here we are, seeing shapes within the shape. And here's that looseness of drawing where you get to rearrange or maybe even do a variation to the pose. Now my lines are extremely, I want to keep them as light as possible, because the other option would be to bring in ink lines as well. Now how is that going to compete with the contrast you're creating, which I think just with that light dark contrast could be very rich. The ink lines could just maybe overdo it for me, but it would be another option. There's this beautiful pose to a shape within the shape again. You want to see it almost three-dimensional as you're drawing the basic line here. And just a hint at that oval that is the head. This is going to be a big main feature here. That focal point that always is the eye, the features, and obviously this beautiful, beautiful beak, which is going to have also some interesting things to say with color. Some blue and gray. So all these things, and there's this nice soft curve to it as well. So we want to take just a little longer, a little time with it. Now, one of my favorite things when drawing a subject like this is how you develop those SC curves of the contour. So notice, for example, here, when you focus on the beak or how it connects with the head, there's this beautiful angle and edge and curve that you can begin to develop. And all of these curves, they take the shape of an S or a C or an S, and they're subtle, and they are what really makes, in terms of drawing, all the difference. Sometimes they get more linear, more straight. So it's how well do you see that S or C shape there? Because it's usually with a subject like this, it's very hard. There should not be any straight lines. So that is an entire exercise on its own there. And you see it here at the top as well. Beautiful, beautiful. Just going from C to S. And then all of these edges and feathers, I'll deal with that also with the brush. So making decisions on what is the skeleton, the foundation that I need for my drawing in order to move to the watercolor work. Only you know when you and how much help, information, mapping, detail. I recommend if you want this and you can visualize what you can do with technique from experience, that's how you know what type of line and how far, how much detail you need to bring in, and how you can then use that, modify it, enhance it, and get a better idea for the next time what it is you're looking for. So that is kind of what I'm doing. I know I want more confidence in this area with the technique and the application of the paint, which is where I'm going to pay a little more attention. Now, all the light mapping and some of the volumes inside, or the feathers, all of that, my plan is brushwork and technique, watercolor techniques. So just a few hints here. And yes, I bring it up again. When you have a beautiful drawing, you're almost guaranteed a beautiful watercolor. Drawing has a lot to do with the final outcome. The key question there is, how far into drawing do I take this watercolor? And I hope that makes sense. Where is the border between a drawing and a watercolor? When does it stop being a drawing and it becomes something else? Knowing that this could just be a pencil drawing and we could just take it all the way, finish details with just pencil. Just getting a little bit of the sense of thickness here as I begin to come outside of it. So some of these edges, a lot of it is negative space play. There's going to be beautiful just touches of watercolor and allowing wet on wet technique to do what that visual quality that I really love. In what you visualize, I actually went ahead and just outside my door picked one of these. And when you have something like this, and it doesn't have to be exactly this one, when you have something that you can work from directly, and it may be ideal to have just maybe a variation of type of leaf, so you can actually see how they behave in 3D, how you would want to, for example, place it visually this way. It would be this way. And create a composition or a variation to the composition that would make a little more sense to you. And notice how that could actually work. Now, depending on the size and the relevance to our subject, this is a great option from life. Always from life gives you, obviously presents more problems, but the way you come up with those solutions, it's literally the best way. It's right in front of you. And it's what we're doing today, why we work from masters. We are looking at how they solved these problems. So I'm beginning to see here, and I'm doing extremely very light line work here, because I have these white flowers. And what I want to do as I create my washes is I'm going to be lifting. So some of it is going to have to be fast, depending on the size of the wash. Some I can do a little more cautious and strategic. But it's something to consider. How am I going to see the spots? So I'm going to work with the center, maybe just hint at the size, and then work a little bit of line with the branch and the stems here. Now this may actually take you a little longer if you want to actually not worry at the time of painting it. Well, then you really want to spend some time strategizing for this and visualizing it. Not making it more confusing, making it easier for when that right time comes. And a lot of this is going to be, again, brushwork. So what I'm doing is I'm just mapping and also studying a little bit how this contrast. Go ahead and zoom in just a little bit in this area. Beautiful, beautiful flower and leaf work. You could see that in the center of the flower we have these very nice, very playful leaf shapes that just give us a little bit of edge as well. So how much of that can you do with brush? How much of that can you do with drawing? What is more convenient for you? And here's one area where I may see, and I'm looking at some of that beautiful, very delicate maybe ink work right at the edge, and how that would actually read, just adding a little more contrast to the softness and lightness of those flowers. There's a lot of overlap and juxtaposition with some of these lines, so you want them to be clear. So we have a beautiful crow, but I'm saying this leaf flower work here could just be it's a whole painting on its own. Finding a way to really showcase that, and again, some of these details with these crossing leaves and simplicity of color. The simplicity of the subject, that white, fluffy, almost empty space really. But there is a variation to the color there. We're gonna figure that one out. And here I'm only gonna use 2 flowers. And then making sure you're keeping track . So as I said, it's helping, not hurting, making it a little more confusing. So I'm at the stage where, okay, I could see how it's coming along, and I'm happy with, so far, with the composition. I could visualize that the way I set it up on this format, it's going to work. I'm going to just, to move a little bit ahead, finish up this I consider very important shape here, with a detail coming into the head and the placement of that eye. So I could, believe it or not, how important it is going to be to be able to move on and finish all the other areas. In terms of size and shape, capturing that three-dimensionality, that roundness, and then some of the detail, again, that will be our focal point. So there we are. And then I can move forward. We have some fluffy feathers, some ruffled, I guess, a little. We'll do that with brushwork. And once again, more flowers. So I noticed I made some of my leaves and flowers maybe a little too big down here. We're going to see the thickness of this branch and how that texture plays along. And it'll be fine. You are allowed to rearrange and replay. Now, unlike me, I actually made them a little larger, so I ran out of room. Hopefully you can plan for that, so it doesn't happen to you. And these small little blossoms are going to be very helpful. Kind of showing me the way. And once again, a little bit of negative space. It almost begins to, at some point, you have to see it and recognize that the level of abstraction of some of the forms. Yes, they're leaves and they're tiny variations to vine and branch. But how to deconstruct those and actually see the abstraction in it. How to simplify that into simpler line and form. And my goal is to do that, to just let the watercolor take advantage of that without me having to force that issue. So some of these branches are crucial to what I'm trying to do with this composition. I'm trying to get those out of the way. Again, more flower. And it's going to be a lot of meticulous work later on for some of these flowers and techniques to actually look the way I want. It's going to be very subtle because of the lightness. So the background and the strategy to develop that, it's going to be very interesting. So we're also going to look at some colors and how we would choose to favor that strategy. So a less staining pigment that you could lift even after it dries. So we actually have more options. We'll look at some of the colors. All these little beautiful shapes here. That eventually will become very linear. And there we go. Let me just finish up over here. We have that, comes down. We have one more. These two beautiful ones right here. And this one. So seeing the composition, how it just comes together beautifully. There's almost something that's a good way of seeing it sometimes, mathematical about the way it's organized. It's another way to deal with compositions. Let's see our last one, where this just becomes all tree. Lots of beautiful, beautiful negative space and things we can create with brushwork and shaping of those edges. But understanding it is going to be the key. So there's my drawing. I'll give it a second look. A little more vertical. And I'm ready for my first wash. So we have this very almost neutral color. Not just black and white, but there's that touch of warm colors. And with that wash that we have, I don't know if you've noticed, there's the moon down here where you can just add that circular effect. And again, it's going to be through lifting mostly. So I want to make sure I pick the right color for that background. And to me, it just the perfect gray, which, how do we create a gray if we don't have one? Now I do have on my watercolor box, I have a warm gray and a cool gray that I've used for years. But how do you create your perfect version of gray? Now if you look at this one, to me, in my image, it looks green. It's like a green gray. It's not a blue gray. So with a green gray, one option you have, if you have an ivory black, and I'm going to just grab a little bit of ivory black, and let's say a warm yellow. So this is New Gamboge. And just a touch of it, you begin to see there's a, well, it just turned a little browner, but there's that gray. And as always, checking it and making sure you create your swatch test, color swatches, where we could make it a little grayer, we could push it a little more, towards the green or a little more towards the blue. And it's the blue in that black. So if you have lamp black or ivory black, you're going to have different versions. It depends on how much blue is in that black. But notice that it almost immediately tends to go towards green. If you have Payne's gray, that would be another option. I have several here. Earth tones and blacks that I could actually play with. And it'd be great to have a test. So I'm going to save this tiny little space at the bottom here where I'm going to make my swatches. And testing ivory black with warm yellow. This is sepia with a little bit of yellow. I also have lunar black, and I think this one's going to be for the bird. So I just want to play with this one. And it does have a lot more granulation than any other. So that's going to be saved for the main subject here. But there's also colors such as neutral tint. And as I mentioned, ivory black or Mars black. And what would be the last option? Are there any other options? Okay, so this one, oof, it's really, really liquid. This is neutral tint. Now this one may work, and it's one that I don't use often. But there's almost a violet feel to it that could be interesting, and it does show up less intense than just a pure black. So neutral tint, there it is. And I'm just showing you this in case you're limited. What would I do? Just lift up a little bit so it dries faster. And you could see the qualities also of the edge as it dries. That's very important. How am I going to deal with that line edge? I was also mentioning for lifting. That's going to be important. So here's my last piece of advice. Create your own by mixing burnt umber and different blues. So you're going to have burnt umber with cobalt blue, burnt umber with ultramarine blue, or burnt umber with whatever blue you have, and you're going to see how you can almost reach a dark gray black. That may be the one you've never met before, but fall in love with. It's always my biggest recommendation when exploring black spectrums. You want to have a choice of temperature. So I'm mixing a little bit of burnt umber, and I'm going to go with the typical is ultramarine. That's my go-to, and it's warmer. So depending on how much blue or how much burnt umber, I'm going to have a warmer or cooler bluer gray. And that's going to be the case here. So this one with extra blue, that's what it looks like. You could hardly tell the difference sometimes with, well, this one's close. But again, I mentioned that neutral tint is so violet. Let me add more burnt umber and put it side by side. And now you have this, well, it's not even gray, it's just a dark brown. There we are. So all the variations, all the options. Within those, I want the perfect gray, which also will be very low in value. And when I create my wash, there's going to be areas I want to just create washes that I could come over. So it's going to be light enough that I can come over with that leaf work, which is warmer and more saturated. It will feed in, it will work. I want it completely lifted off of my flowers. I want that to be as white as possible. So it should not be too staining. There are colors that stain and penetrate the paper way more than others. You want one choice that allows you to lift even after it dries as much as possible. But it's something I can wash pretty much all over. There's not a lot of white except for the white of the eye in my bird, and everything else could get, in terms of value, that dark. So with that, we test and adding just a little more blue, making sure we get just enough of that green quality. I'm going to test it right here, and I actually love this version that I mixed down here. That was burnt umber with a lot of ultramarine, more ultramarine than burnt umber, and it read really well. So different options here. If I want that little bit of gradient, we want to create a wet on wet wash, but we're also going to be dealing with the lifting. So very quickly, I have to grab tissue paper, which I prefer to paper towels. So when someone grabs your tissue paper, you don't know where it is. The other option would be toilet paper. It's just the softness and the way it absorbs. I'm going to break this into a few different pieces so I can do that. And again, considering where and how much of that gradient you want, the technique of application. I'm going to use a bigger brush and clean water. Wetting the entire area. Now the other thing you can do, and it's a little more complicated sometimes, to wet the area and then dry because there's so many of them, some of them bigger than others. You may waste too much time. And I think that should be far enough right there. Leave a little extra for that moon, the corner of the moon. But we want it to reach all the way down here. You see me circling here, just drawing the moon with water, basically. Soaking this paper all the way down to these, so it's in the background of these white flowers. Otherwise there would be no way to bring them out, and it's going to be the lightest area. So I want to really soak this one. It's because it's that rough paper, it soaks up so fast. But once we have that, and I have my color mixed ready to go, I also have the tissue paper, and this is where we put all those technique elements to the test. So I'm going to use this brush, a little more even, and I also have a dry brush ready to go in case I need to lift a little sharper. So I'm going to use gravity as well. So I'm lifting this a little bit since I'm working flat. And we're just going to drop it in. I am going to try to avoid just a little bit certain areas, those whiter areas. And immediately you begin to see this quality of wash here. Ooh, nice. Letting it go pretty much everywhere. And as it drops down, it begins to get just a little bit lighter. There's some white that you may want to preserve as well on the branch, and I just saw this here, and it's actually a light gray. Give it just a quick second pass on certain. And before it's too late, I want to begin to lift as I see my wash coming down. And that's enough. That's as dark as I want it. And the gradient, even if it's not ideal, let it sit for a little. And I'm going to go right into that tissue paper lifting. Now you may have a brush that works better. I think with tissue paper it's going to do extremely well. So just creating the shape and the tip and just lifting up as much as you can. Stopping that drying process right at the edge. Here's where that drawing comes in handy. So some of the lines may begin to be a little visible. And I mean the edges of some of your drawing. But you begin to see them pop up. That's what you want. The variation to the wash, especially in these darker areas, that's where we get the big payoff with these flowers. Get a little more tissue paper, making that point tiny so we could get some of the smaller ones. And that's where I would use more of a light and dry brush. And I'll show you how to lift with a different brush. I might want to do that right now. So I'm going to use, this is a synthetic brush with a little bit of clean water and maybe even the same tissue paper so it dries enough to touch it up. And as you brush, you rub some of that pigment. But the idea here is picking up, mopping up. And you can see how it's lifting. So lifting with the brush, you have to have the right brush. But again, it's only with certain pigments. Bring in a little more wet, clean water. Continue pulling that. Let's do a little off of this one here. And sometimes just adding water right at the moment of the wash does the job to push that pigment and create, I mean, it came all the way, almost all the way back to the white of the paper. There's a few small ones here. You definitely want to do these with the brush. And right away, it came right off. Now, we've seen the stenciling and tools like the Mr. Clean, where you could pretty much wait until it's fully dry and it still brings it all the way back. Those are things you really want to try and experiment with. Make it part of your technique. One more right here. This is the part where I mentioned sometimes strategy and technique. Well, one of the easiest ways for some would be to just use masking fluid. And that way you just focus on your wash. And then just lift the masking. I'm not a big fan of that, and depending on the type of work you want to do, this type of masking or lifting is, when we talk about developing techniques, is where you need to focus. How often and how much are you going to be using it? and which is the best way to get those results. So understanding, well, what kind of result am I expecting as well? Going all the way up to the top here, the most saturated part of the wash, and trying to lift some. Sometimes you can rub too much and you realize you're hurting the paper. What you're doing is removing the sizing, which is what makes watercolor paper different. So you don't want to go that far. And I know it doesn't look, it's a lot lighter, but when you look at it with the proper light, there it is right there. You could see how just that soft difference in value. That's all I want. Because when I bring in the contrast of the warm branches and the leaves, I think that will absolutely work. And as I mentioned, I could recreate smaller areas with soft edge. This is risky because it's still wet, but bringing some of this soft edge work right around the white of those flowers is another option as well. Now it all depends on how you use this technique and the timing of it as well. It's not the easiest to blend a gradient wash into a background that you already set up. So there we are. So with that same base that we have here now, I'm going to use that same gray, and I'm going to begin to consider, let's say, a little warmer version by adding sepia to that gray and maybe lowering the value. And we're going to test it right over here. So as you can see, well, this is not the right brush. I want to make sure I have that perfect value and temperature. Color, you get, like I said, it's almost dealing with black and white all the way through. But if I can manage temperature throughout, I think that's a better thing to aim at. So, level of moisture here, still wet, doing a little bit of wet on wet. This one, I actually want it to be wet on dry. I'm just drawing what would be kind of the first layer of the maybe 2 or 3 that I will be bringing in to create some of the light and shadow that I see on this branch here. Preserving some of the white, just like I am here. And maybe doing a little bit of wet on wet on a couple of different areas, just for that extra organic, natural looking texture. So you may be able to see that there's maybe 3 or 4 variations of gray that you can play with there. I want to start with the lightest one, and that's going to be almost blending into the wash of the background. But some of these other ones, I want to make sure they don't get too dark and compete with the contrast of my bird. But also not too light, where they just kind of wash into the background. So that's my main focus here. And I think so far I'm right where I want to be in terms of not just color temperature, but the value of these grays. Now drawing, and I did not draw or map out these shapes. I could see them, and as best as I can, I'm trying to visualize how this and the second or third layer are going to work together. How in some areas it becomes kind of abstract, and I need to look a lot closer. So this is going to enhance, believe it or not, some of these flowers by just going in and around the edges of it, bringing them out even more. Creating that sense of space through juxtaposition. So this goes into the back, flower comes forward. Notice, for example, here, that's going to be the look. And the contrast when it comes to those flowers. So once we reach here, it gets a little flatter. There's not a lot of light, not a lot of detail. And there we go again. It's as things get smaller, more complex, and they also get sharper, you want to do less. Depending on what you're doing, you want to do less attention to it. So this becomes flatter, lighter, thinner, sharper edge. You want to simplify it. So this would be stage one. And I want to make sure I don't miss any areas where I could be doing this, taking advantage of it. And knowing that also it could still, and it will work really, really well when we bring in those warm brown colors. So I'm actually layering in some of this gray, hoping it shows up just a little bit when we bring those browns. Areas like here, some of these. Bring it down into this area here. Even though it gets a little, this is where I mentioned maybe ink lines. It gets so sharp in terms of edges. I'm just going to add a little bit of that gray. Make it delicate. But a lot of it, most of it, I should say, most of it, it's very loose work. It's fine-tuned, fine-detailed, small brush. But the quality of it is loose. I want a lot of these watercolor, whether it's wet on dry, flat washes, to really begin to set it up. Set up the stage. for what will be, again, simple in terms of, well, again, careful with the use of that word. When it comes to simplicity of technique, yes, there's a lot to it, of course. But as we push forward a little, I'm adding a little more saturation to this pigment, a little more pigment to it, and bring some of these in the darker area of my wash just a little bit. Just like that. So we begin to get that sense of space. Very important. I'm going into the crow. So to have a strategy here, very important. Number one, moisture. What's happening to levels of moisture where you don't want bleeding, you want control of edges. What's happening inside my crow, and I want to actually start by selecting the color. I mentioned lunar black, but I saw this, and this is just ivory black, a little bit left over, with some of that gray I mixed with burnt umber and ultramarine blue. And I want this just a little bit darker, a little bit grayer than the colors I have here for the first layer of the bird. Now, what does that mean? It's going to get a lot darker. So yes, this is not, it's darker than what I have on the page now, but it's a lot lighter than what I planned. And why is that? I don't want white to pop through any of the washes that I'm going to create. So I want this to be somewhat a base, and it's going to be my wet wash, basically. So I could do more of the wet on wet. Make sure you have your colors mixed and ready. And also make sure you're working with the right size and right qualities of brush. And ideally you want to do this in sections. Like I'll work the head, but I'm working with a lot of moisture. That's why I'm using a mop, a quill, and not letting it dry. So I can have that fine tip, but also adding a lot of moisture, moving it around. So let's think of this wash as the skin, and then I'm going to work those feathers. If any of the color or the wet on wet techniques show through, this is the color you're going to see, which is a light version of a dark. And it's still harmonious or relating to the colors in the background as well. So this is going to be the tricky part, where what technique goes where, and you almost want that one and done feel to it. Yes, the strategizing and setup, such as this one here, may take a little bit of time. And now this is, while it dries, again, running it through, making sure it stays just wet enough. Because most of it is not wet on wet. I would call this wet on moist, what I'm about to do. So I don't want it to be fully wet. I want it more moist. So there's that soft feathering. And a little more edge to some of the strokes. So it takes perfect timing, more than anything. Perfect setup. There it is, fully wet. Working some of that edge, some of the feather very carefully. And with this lunar black, now you could see a few variations to the level of that black, the granulation of it. So if you can, you want to be looking closely. But notice how I'm just dabbing it in. And I'm squinting at this time. So it's not just a solid black wash, wet on wet, that has a little bit of feathery effect here and there. No, I'm looking at the more saturated areas, meaning darker. When I squint, revisiting, and it's mostly out here on these edges. But I'm not drawing with it anymore. I'm just dabbing it in and letting that granulation take effect. And you can almost see the feathers already. Just, yep, reading as feathers without much brushwork needed. Matter of fact, what you want is water and pigment to do this for you. The more you get away with that, the more you know how to brush less, the better. Learning how to almost do a magic trick where you just drop it in, but because of the way you set it up, and the motion of the brush when you drop it in, you automatically get that effect. So I mentioned wet on moist. I'm actually going a little wet on wet here. Should have been a little more patient because I'm losing some of the edges, and I do want some of these edges to hold. So you could do this in maybe 2-3 stages or layers, where you notice here some of these brush strokes, you see some space between them. I'm doing this on purpose here, so you see that in the chest area. You see some almost feather-like motions with the brush that then hold the shape. So I'm going to do it a little bit less here, realizing I should have waited just a little bit longer. Nothing much you could do if you went too early or too late. Sometimes, I don't know which one's worse. It depends on. Sometimes late, you can still rework, come back and re-wet it. Too early, it depends on how much pigment you're putting in. Sometimes you're going from what I did with that very light. So see, this one here is a little drier. So it's wet on moist, but I get that effect with that nice edge. That's still moving. And you want to stay as light as possible, as long as possible. Yes, even with black. Because there will be stages here. And I begin to shape, trying to create that volume. I'm going to bring a variation. Got to be careful here because I'm bringing a variation to the temperature of this black by adding a tiny bit of sepia. A little warmer. It's going to have less granulation, and it's for this area here. And right now this bird is looking a little ruffled, caught in the rain maybe. Again, it's really knowing when that ideal stage of moisture. Reason I love this paper, it just continues to wash. I'm dropping in some water, which is what I wanted to do from the beginning, and have just that cauliflower effect take hold. And for that, I have to wait. Definitely don't want to bring in a hair dryer. This one really has to, the water has to push the pigment, and you have to really be patient, allowing it to develop. So this one is going to be a little more blue than burnt umber when it goes to grace, but actually it's going to be a cool blue, cobalt blue. And I'm going into the beak. So the first wash, this one's actually going to be very light. Almost cobalt blue with a tiny touch of gray, just for the edges. Again, no gotta be careful, it's still very wet. And this is just a wet on dry. Bringing in a little extra bit of water. And I'm also going to do a lift of pigment right in the middle. To create that rounding sense of the volume. Just passing a dry brush a few times. I think the color looks great. Dropping in a little more saturation right here at the edges. And also tiny bit right at the tip. Just one touch of color there. And it had that little bit extra shade. Touching it right at the bottom again. And there you begin to see that volume. Now, something you may not, if you haven't seen it yet, this, see, I have to wait. This is still wet. But there's a light violet or blue circle around that black of the eye. And you want to bring a little bit of that in there. But you want to make sure it's fully dry. And right now, it is not. So I'll come back to that. And while I let all of this dry, because I can come back second and third pass and sharpen some of those edges, some of those feathers. But this granulation actually is going to work really well. What I'm doing right now is checking some of these edges with the smaller brush and adding just a little bit of feathering to that edge. Getting that out of the way while it's still wet. Just pulling some of that moisture right to the edge. not too much. You don't want too many of them or too small either. A little curving. And we're going to see some of these edges just round, so the feather shape right at the tip. Just like that. So I'm going all the way around, checking those edges, checking the shapes, and using the moisture on this bird right now to almost finalize. One of the hardest parts, really, the detail of the edges. Although everything is edges, every brush stroke you bring in has edges. How you bring them all together, that's the key. There we go. So while I wait for this to dry, I'm going to begin, switch brush again, mix the color, and this one seems pretty immediate to me. I have quinacridone gold. Somehow it yellow ochre, maybe a touch of green. There's sort of a silver green effect. Maybe it's a double layer. So I'm going to touch it with a tiny, tiny bit of that neutral tint. So the yellow ochre and that neutral tint, which I mentioned, has this kind of violet bias to it. It may get us there. Next thing I want to do, make it really light in value and test out the first one here. So this brush may be too big. I was working with the number 3. I'm going to drop down to a number 1. That's better. And this will also let me work some of these beautiful linear shapes. So some of the drawings, and I'm going also a little more yellow into the flower centers. So making the right color selection here is crucial. And I almost want to finish this with one pass, meaning there are some linear qualities within the leaf, which for me begin to show a little too much detail. That's where I mentioned that very, very thin ink line kind of doing the work, delivering that detailed quality that we have going on there. And doing a little more wet on wet on each of these. Have those beautiful pencil lines helping me out. So just enough drawing to almost color it in. But it's something else you can do. Just draw in with watercolor as you get more comfortable with your composition. Making that decision in the moment. Well, that's a whole different level. Of confidence. Loved how this crossing of very thin elements working together, and it's all of the combination of that soft, ultra soft background with the contrast that we have right next to, which is the bird, the whiteness, which is also the contrast of the flowers, and then some of these more linear elements, which are very delicate. Beautiful. And also they have that minimalistic, although there's a lot going on here, they have that simplicity, that look of simplicity. Which, as you can see now, yep, it's how you decided to set it up and how comfortable you can just deliver your technique here. It could be simple. There we go. So that's the kind of work, if you want this kind of look. But there's a lot going on within these colors because of those mixture of colors that I did. And I'll come back while it's still wet and drop in a little more color there. I'm beginning to just jazz it up on my own. So looking at the reference, but also what's going on my page, whatever the washes gave me, and the edges and the lines and some of the pencil lines. With the caution of not being reckless, adding just anything wherever, but using what's there plus the read of the negative space. To maybe add something else to it. Something that wasn't there, but somehow now you see works for you, for your composition. So I just realized that the blue I used here on the beak and this color contrast, something I never thought of until now, until I saw it, because the closeness of it, it's how you make all the different combinations of contrast work for you. In this case, color contrast, enhancing each other. And that level of gray that I added to the beak because it's not as simple as blue and orange, complementary colors, color contrast. There's a level of orange that is not real orange here. You could call this more yellow. There's actually more green as it goes towards the gray than orange. Same with the blue. It's not blue. There's gray. That matter of fact, maybe going a little towards, well, just very neutral, really. So beyond just being complementary, they're also, in a sense, a neutrality. The level of neutrality of those complementary colors makes it even, gives it more of a feel of harmony. So before it fully dries, this is that state, and it's still very wet. Some of these are drying a little faster. Just want to touch a little bit of tip. And it's just adding saturation, basically. It's a layer on top of a layer, but it's still very wet. So we'll hold off just a little more. And they are drying differently. In the center it's wetter, and the edges it's drier. So you have to be aware of that. Something else that you have to deal with. So this is the work I anticipated would take longer. I stuck with just one color, the combination of that quinacridone gold with a little bit of the neutral tint. And it worked beautiful. But you could also, I mentioned there's a little bit of gray or green. And also I see red. Just these very thin red lines, the veins of these leaves. And it's not in every single one. There's a few, like up here. In these, you begin to see a little bit of red, where you may also read it as more of an orange. So the variety of color play you could do with linear qualities, with technique, or with color combinations. All those arenas where you could showcase. And masterpieces usually nail it in every single one of those. The linear qualities, the composition qualities, the contrast, the balance of the contrast, and then the color harmonies, the color selections, the looseness of all of those techniques, and how the artist displays confidence, which comes from the comfort, the knowledge that, yep, this works with this. Or maybe it's just experimenting, and the more you experiment, the more things work. Maybe not 10 out of 10, but maybe 8 out of 10. And I don't bring it up often because it's not the way I think. Although we need, the more, call it advanced, you become in your own work, the more you seek for a specific result, whether it's in, again, line, drawing quality, color quality, overall composition. We could be very hard judges on our work. Most people are. But there's something, and you may have heard it over and over. It's learning from your mistakes that makes you better. But then you have to learn to analyze and study your own work to realize what is a mistake, why was it a mistake, and it's that really, I believe, being your own teacher, where you know a little closer what are the things that you're looking for, and you are a very objective judge of your work, where you could see, yep, that worked, well, that was good enough, or no, too harsh, where nope, still not perfect, and it needs to be perfect. It's mostly a kind of personality characteristic where they're both fine. It depends on which one you are, but it comes to this. You see it as failing. So all you got to do is, if you see it as failure, oh, I failed, it failed, then you just fail better. Because you try, and when you try, you just try better. But learning from those mistakes, what you call them mistakes, it's what you really, truly, what you take away from them. The quality of analysis that you can bring to your own work, and the kindness, because it takes a little bit of kindness. In a way, it's also, there's a level of balance, how you have to judge your work. You have to be hard enough where you realize, okay, this needs to be better, but kind, where you don't frustrate. Okay, so my bird is dry. I need to go in with that second coat, but I do love how some of these feathers already, and again, it's all granulation, as you can see. I'm going to use that same quinacridone gold, but I'm going to touch it with a tiny bit of, well, actually maybe nothing. And I'm going to touch just a speck. Oop, too much. Go to my smallest brush here. And I'm just going to bring in tiny little specks of the center of the flower. And maybe just add sort of a seed shape to it. Don't want it to compete too much with all the other elements. They just happen to be there very quietly, but beautifully. The little space in between them. I mentioned that red on some of the veins of the leaves. That's up to you. I think for this one it might be a little too much. I love the way it's working. Maybe just layering a few strokes, wet on dry, of a more saturated color. Just like this. Could do a little bit better. And there are some pencil lines, because I did see that early on. So I still have a lot of work to go with on this tree trunk here. I want to get that out of the way. So I'm going to add a little more, in this case, sepia. And touch it with a little bit of ultramarine. I like that gray, blue, that cool bluish gray quality. But the cool, maybe cobalt instead. So let me just test it. The sepia has that nice quality and also a little bit of granulation that I like. The ultramarine was a little bit too warm. So I think, yep, the answer is going to be cobalt. Now here, again, I want to be careful not to push this too far. Make sure I want to use the right brush. For that linear quality, it's going to get a little bit smaller. And it basically is just a shadow edge of the bottom of the tree coming in and around. This is the one that you don't want to compete. So I made it a little bit, doesn't look it, but I made it a little bit lighter. I'm adding a little touch of water, both for technique, but also to lighten it just a little bit more. Although it will dry a lot lighter. I don't want it to be too big of a jump from one, and maybe it is just, there's a degree of subtleness when you go from value, let's say 4 to value 2, instead of from value 4 to value, so there's 1, 2, 3 steps you jump. Sometimes that's a little too much. And if you make it too gradual, then it's not enough contrast. I hope that made sense. You want to take small steps that are not too harsh. And what I was seeing here was a little bit too much of hard edge. And then the quality of the drawing with the brush to add that tree bark quality. But the main concern is how you're dealing with these soft shadows there. There we are. Just a little more right up in here. That's it. Well, I think a few things will really bring it closer to finished. I think that eye is going to be one of those that is going to really have a lot to say. And because I need, bring in that cobalt blue, more cobalt blue than a little bit of gray, neutralizing the color. Want it low value, and all I need to do is preserve that little highlight speck of white. But there's that beautiful blue ring right around the eye. And then in the middle we'll just have that pupil. I gotta say, I like the bird as it is. I fear risking that second wash in some areas. I know I need a few of those edge linear qualities. But looking at it closely, it's got that, it almost looks like charcoal sitting on top of, beautiful. So let's go ahead and consider here. I know something will give me a big clue will be the feet, which is why I did that early wash all over. And we have these very subtle. I think for this one, I'm going to go with ivory black, just for quickness. It's a little darker. Don't want to use that lunar black all over. And looking very closely here, we have these very subtle linear drawing qualities, patterns on the feet, the scales basically. And then the patterns going up the leg. But again, you got to make sure they're ultra. In this case, they're small. There's a lot of them, which is another thing to consider. They're darker and they're sharper. So you want all those things to not overdo it. Very careful, because it's definitely very easy to overdo it here. There we go. So that layering really works. It actually did enhance. It did enhance the look. It needed that bit of sharpness there. And I'm almost regretting the one I did a little too dark right in here of these leaves. So I'm just removing a little bit of that saturation, softening the edge. There we go. And finally, I'm going to go ahead and bring in not too heavy in saturation. And I'm going to go into these first. So starting at the bottom. Making sure I get some of that edge. So this is all wet on dry. Making sure I get a good sense of where it starts, how it ends, and try to capture that in one kind of swift brush stroke. Not much to it. There's just the edge, where it starts and how it ends, the roundness of it. I could drop a little bit of wet on there. And it really is basically drawn in where you could easily see the drawing quality and the edges of it. But the most important thing when working like this in these layers is not just painting over, which is what I'm getting the feeling of right now. painting over that beautiful, very unique, very original wash that was sitting there, and it's just covering it up. My feel is when you can do something that looked like this wash. Remember how I laid it down, where it was just dabbing it in? Water and pigment really did all of the work. They truly did. I was more of that instrument just to handle and drop pigment, but the pigment and the water did all of this. And now for me to come back over and kind of fix it, it's the feeling I don't want to have. I want it to be showcased. And by doing this is where you have to be careful. Because it's very easy to just paint over, and you can lose all the beautiful things you had there already. And sometimes all it takes is one stroke. One stroke too many. One wrong stroke somewhere where you didn't need it to realize, oh, I like what was there before. How can I get it back? Well, you got to start over and hope. But most likely, nope, not happening. And that's a bit of the difference between what it means to be in control or to let go of control and have it work. And with that feathering, it's very hard to do a layer on top of a layer that works the way the first one. Sometimes a layer is just a layer and the enhancement work is linear like this one. But is there a way? Can I figure out a way to get the second quality with that same beautiful, almost magical from technique? It's only from technique. And how you decide to use that. For me, it's just to put it plain and simple, it is that wet on wet. It is why watercolor. I think watercolor is beautiful. How it achieves something very few other mediums can, and is understanding who's in control. So here we're going to go into, this is just, again, ivory black, wrong brush. And I'm just going to touch that eye right there very carefully. Now this is something a lot of artists would actually do with the ink pen for precision. But the kind of work you want to do with with the brushes that you own is also that knowing, can I get hair thin qualities? And I also saw these beautiful little just hair thin, almost thickness of an eyelash. And bringing it all together. Just want to give you a quick closer look. I know sometimes working with this level of detail, there's some of that very thin, that's my finest brush, a 00, and it's trying to work with literally one hair at the proper moisture level. Wet on dry was, if you could see that very thin line right in the middle of the beak, that sometimes could just easily be an ink line, and it would be hard to tell the difference. But these qualities, I hope you could see that. The first original wash that we had, and then layering very carefully over so you don't lose that. Now it looks a little thick on the feet, but all of these flowers just popping up lightly with the beautiful contrast of the warm leaves, maybe doing a little extra work on the leaves. There we have it. Beautiful, beautiful crow. Only one way to do it. So whether you decide to bring in ink lines, color pencil, which I've been suggesting, or any other mixed media technique to do the finishing touches, for this one I would really just stick to, in my case, I will stick to that fine watercolor linear type of brushwork, because there's already so much there. Got to be happy with it. And there we have it, a beautiful crow. Hope you guys enjoyed it.